The year was 1852, a time when the Dakota Territory was still a vast, untamed land caught between the encroaching presence of settlers and the deep-rooted traditions of its native people. Harsh winds swept across the rolling plains, carrying with them the scent of pine from the distant Black Hills and the dust of earth hardened by long winters. It was a land of beauty and hardship, where survival demanded strength, resilience, and above all, loyalty to kin. Communities, whether of settlers or native tribes, lived in tight circles, bound by necessity as much as by custom. In the small settlements along the frontier, whispers often carried further than truth. At trading posts and missionary stations scattered across the prairies, news traveled by word of mouth, sometimes grounded in fact, other times colored with suspicion. One particular story, however, would not remain confined to whispers. It began with the troubling observations of a traveling physician, Dr. Jonathan Miller, who had been sent by the territorial authorities to evaluate the health conditions among several Sioux bands. He arrived during the late spring, when the land was beginning to stir with new life after the long frost. But what he would encounter was not renewal. It was a quiet, unsettling tragedy. The first signs came in the form of hushed conversations. A fur trader from St. Paul spoke of a strange affliction among the children of a respected Sioux chief. Another claimed that missionaries, when attempting to teach letters and prayers, noticed that several of the children never responded to the light of the sun or the flicker of the fire. At first, Dr. Miller assumed the reports to be exaggerations, or perhaps cases of childhood illness misinterpreted by those unfamiliar with medicine. But curiosity and duty pressed him forward, drawing him deeper into the Dakota Territory toward the chief's encampment. When he arrived, he was struck immediately by the isolation. The Sioux camp lay on the edge of a wooded valley near the Missouri River, far from the usual trade routes. The village appeared quiet, dignified, its people carrying themselves with the proud reserve of their heritage. Yet there was an undercurrent, a weight in the air, like an unspoken grief. Women kept their children close, and their gazes lingered too long on the visitor. It was during his first meeting with the chief that Dr. Miller sensed the heart of the mystery. The chief, a man of strong presence and advanced years, greeted him with respect but with guarded caution. Behind him, half hidden within the lodge, were children who did not look up when the door flap opened. Their heads tilted slightly at the sounds around them, but their eyes, pale and clouded, did not follow the light. In that moment, Dr. Miller felt a chill run down his spine. This was not mere rumor, nor was it an ordinary misfortune of birth. Something far more disturbing lay beneath the surface, and it would not remain hidden forever. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that a painful truth was about to be uncovered. This was the beginning of a story that would ripple through the frontier, forcing settlers, missionaries, and native families alike to confront questions of secrecy, tradition, and the devastating cost of silence within bloodlines. The journey into the heart of the Dakota Territory was not for the faint of spirit. Dr. Jonathan Miller's wagon creaked and groaned over the uneven earth, the wooden wheels cutting deep into ruts formed by countless seasons of rain and thaw. The Missouri River lay some miles behind him, its currents strong and unforgiving, but now the land opened into a sweep of endless prairie. Here and there, stands of cottonwood trees rose like guardians against the horizon, while the distant Black Hills seemed to hover like dark sentinels. By the time Dr. Miller reached the Sioux encampment, the sun was dipping low, casting the land in hues of amber and shadow. Smoke curled upward from small fires scattered across the village, the faint aroma of roasted corn and buffalo meat drifting on the wind. Children moved quietly between the lodges, their laughter strangely absent. Even from a distance, Miller could sense something unspoken that hung heavy over the place. He dismounted, brushing the dust from his coat, and was met by two men of the tribe who approached with solemn composure. Their faces were unreadable, though their eyes carried the weight of vigilance. With a respectful gesture, they guided him toward the largest lodge, where the chief resided. The air was thick with silence as Miller walked through the camp. Women glanced up briefly from their tasks, then lowered their gazes. The stillness felt unnatural, like a community holding its breath. The chief's lodge stood at the center, its hide coverings decorated with painted symbols of battles fought and victories claimed. Inside, the dim light of a small fire illuminated the figure of Chief Wakantanka, a man in his 50s with hair streaked gray, but shoulders still broad and commanding. His presence was undeniable, yet his expression carried an exhaustion that seemed etched deeper than age. The initial greeting was formal, measured through the work of a young interpreter who had traveled with Miller. The chief extended hospitality but little warmth, offering food and a place to sit by the fire. Miller noticed that the chief's gaze flickered toward a corner of the lodge, where two children sat huddled together. Their postures were still, their faces quiet, but what unsettled him most was the way they stared, not at him, nor at the flame, but into the emptiness before them. Later, as he moved about the camp under the chief's cautious permission, Miller observed more of the village. The lodges were well constructed, their interiors neatly organized with furs, tools, and modest belongings. There was no sign of neglect or poverty, only the marks of a community striving to maintain dignity despite hardship. And yet, everywhere he turned, he saw the same thing. Children who did not meet his eyes, children whose movements seemed guided by sound and touch rather than sight. He paused near a group of women weaving baskets. One of them, perhaps a mother, held a young boy close. The child's features were striking, his eyes pale, unseeing, and framed by lashes that seemed to tremble with the effort of listening. The woman's grip tightened as Miller looked on, her expression both protective and defensive. It was clear she did not welcome his gaze. By the time night fell, the unease within Miller had hardened into certainty. This was no isolated case. What he had stumbled upon was something larger, more entrenched, and more troubling than he had imagined. Though the village bore all the signs of a proud and capable people, there was an undeniable shadow stretching across its children. And behind that shadow, he began to suspect, lay a truth no one wished to speak aloud. Dr. Jonathan Miller awoke early the next morning, his rest shallow and restless. The rhythmic hum of drums in the distance had lulled him into uneasy dreams, and when dawn arrived, the first rays of sunlight spilling over the prairie only sharpened the questions swirling in his mind. He stepped outside the small tent that had been offered to him, the cool morning air carrying a faint mist rising from the nearby river. The camp was already stirring to life, women preparing food, men tending to horses, but the atmosphere remained subdued, as though voices and laughter were deliberately restrained. He began his observations carefully, not wanting to intrude more than his position already demanded. As he walked through the camp, he noticed details that might have escaped a casual visitor. Many of the children remained close to their mothers, their movements tentative, their steps hesitant, as if each one required careful calculation. Some touched the ground with their hands before sitting, while others clung tightly to older siblings for guidance. When a sudden crack of wood echoed from a nearby fire, several children flinched violently, their heads turning toward the sound though their eyes betrayed no recognition of its source. The realization deepened. These were not temporary ailments. These were children living permanently without sight. Their pale, clouded eyes told the truth their parents refused to voice. It was not one child, not two, but many, too many for chance. At midday, Miller was permitted to sit with the chief and his family. The interpreter helped bridge the words, but some truths were unspoken. The chief's eldest daughter, a woman in her 20s, carried a toddler on her hip. The child's head lolled against her shoulder, its tiny face turned toward Miller without truly seeing him. The mother avoided his eyes, her lips pressed tightly, as though she knew the judgment forming in his mind. During the meal, he noted another unsettling pattern. The children bore striking resemblances to one another. Features so similar, they seemed more like siblings than cousins. The same high cheekbones, the same angular jawlines, the same pale gray eyes. It was as if the village's younger generation had been carved from the same stone, each variation smaller than the last. That evening, Miller took careful notes in his journal by the firelight. His training as a physician compelled him to consider natural causes, disease, malnutrition, exposure to toxins, but none explained the uniformity of the condition he observed. Blindness existed, yes, but rarely in clusters so tightly bound by family. The pattern suggested something more intimate, something rooted within bloodlines. The more he watched, the more he noticed subtle behaviors that hinted at secrecy. When Miller's gaze lingered too long on a child, a mother would shift to block his view. When he asked simple questions about family connections, how many sons, how many daughters, the answers were vague, sometimes contradictory. The interpreter, too, seemed unsettled, glancing nervously at the chief as though wary of translating too much. Late into the night, Miller scribbled a single line beneath his scattered notes. "This is no illness of the body alone. It is an inheritance." The thought left him cold. It was too soon to draw conclusions, yet the signs pressed heavily upon him. Something within this isolated community, preserved by silence and tradition, had given rise to a tragedy of the most intimate kind. He sensed that if he pushed further, if he peeled back the protective layers of dignity and secrecy, he would uncover a truth darker than any disease. And yet, even with his training and resolve, part of him hesitated. He was a guest among a proud people. To accuse them outright would be an offense. But to remain silent would mean turning his back on children born into darkness, condemned by choices not their own. The silence of the camp pressed in around him, and in that silence, Dr. Miller knew the true investigation had only just begun. The Dakota Territory of 1852 was a land in transition. While settlers carved their claims along the Missouri River and missionaries built small outposts, the Sioux people still held firmly to their ancestral ways. Their lives were intertwined with the rhythms of the seasons, the hunt, the gathering, the spiritual ceremonies that bound each family to the whole. Yet beneath this proud continuity, pressures mounted. Diseases brought by whites, dwindling buffalo herds, and the encroachment of farms pressed tribes into smaller circles of survival. Isolation, once a strength, was slowly hardening into a prison. Chief Wakantanka had led his band through decades of these shifting winds. His authority came not only from lineage but from his proven wisdom in matters of hunting, warfare, and negotiation. Yet, within his family, the boundaries of tradition and secrecy seemed to blur. Among the Sioux, cousin marriage was not unknown, but the lines of kinship were carefully drawn and respected. Still, in an isolated band, where choice was limited and alliances strained, the rules could bend under the weight of necessity or desire. Old records kept by traders and missionaries hinted at the roots of the mystery. As Dr. Miller examined ledgers at a trading post days before his journey, he had noticed notes of barter from 20 years earlier. The entries listed the chief's family trading hides, corn, and crafted goods. But curiously, the names repeated often. Few new families appeared in the records, as though the band had remained closed to outsiders for decades. The more he pieced together, the more he realized this was not a village open to marriage alliances with neighboring groups. It was a community drawing inward, binding itself too tightly. Neighbors from other Sioux bands whispered cautiously of the chief's family. They spoke of children who rarely appeared at larger gatherings, of women who bore sons and daughters, but seldom spoke of who had fathered them. Outsiders sometimes suspected illness or misfortune, but few dared challenge the authority of a respected chief. Silence was easier than confrontation, and in the fragile balance of tribal politics, secrecy often became survival. For Dr. Miller, the implications grew heavier with each observation. Blindness on such a scale could not be explained by chance. It echoed the hidden patterns he had read of in European medical journals. Families in isolated villages struck by similar misfortunes after generations of intermarriage. But here, on the American frontier, it was not a European story in print. It was a reality unfolding in front of him, in the quiet glances of children who could not see the sun rise. The historical context made the situation even more tragic. The Dakota tribes, already under immense pressure from land treaties and dwindling resources, had little room to confront scandals within their own communities. To admit such a truth would weaken the chief's authority, invite judgment from missionaries, and expose the band to humiliation before other tribes. Thus, secrecy became the only shield. Behind the walls of lodges and the silence of mothers, the truth was guarded as fiercely as any border. Miller, reflecting on the larger picture, realized he stood not merely before a medical case but a cultural wound. The intersection of isolation, tradition, and necessity had created a silence that bred tragedy. What began as an attempt to preserve the community had, over years, twisted into something darker, a cycle hidden from the world, producing children who bore the cost of choices never theirs to make. And now, as the physician walked the quiet paths of the camp, he felt the full weight of history pressing down. This was not just about one chief's family. It was about how isolation, left unchecked, could turn even the strongest traditions into a curse. The more time Dr. Jonathan Miller spent in the encampment, the more his unease hardened into suspicion. His role as a physician allowed him to move quietly between families, offering small remedies for coughs, fevers, and joint pain, but his true focus remained on the children. What struck him most was the sheer consistency of their condition. Blindness might afflict a family by chance, but here it appeared with unsettling uniformity, passed down from one household to the next. During his examinations, Miller made careful notes. Several children were not only blind, but also displayed physical frailties, slight deformities of the jaw, narrow chests, limbs that trembled under their own weight. These were not the ordinary marks of frontier hardship. They spoke of something deeper, something rooted in generations rather than environment. He compared the children in his mind. Their similarities were undeniable. The same bone structure repeated itself, almost as though the village's children were variations of a single form. The chief remained guarded. Each time Miller raised a question about parentage, his words were met with long silences, broken only by vague gestures or the shifting of eyes toward the interpreter. When asked if the blind children belonged to different fathers or if marriages had taken place with neighboring bands, the answers grew muddled. One mother insisted her child's father had been a warrior lost in battle. Another claimed a distant cousin had passed through seasons earlier. Yet the timelines never aligned, and the faces of the children told a different story. One afternoon, Miller visited a small lodge on the edge of the camp. An elderly woman sat weaving quietly, her hands moving with practiced grace. She was not blind, but her grandchildren sitting nearby all bore the pale, clouded eyes. When Miller gently asked about their lineage, her expression hardened. Through the interpreter, she answered with a simple phrase, "We do not speak of such things." It was not anger in her voice, but something closer to fear, a fear of what words might unleash if spoken aloud. Later that evening, as Miller sat by his fire, he reread his scattered notes. He began underlining connections, circling names, and jotting down half-formed questions. How many generations? When did it begin? Why the silence? Slowly, the suspicion formed into a grim hypothesis. The blindness was no accident, no curse of nature. It was the result of consanguinity, of unions between blood too close. He had read of it in medical texts, but never had he seen its reality etched so starkly into children's faces. Yet suspicion alone was dangerous. To accuse a respected chief of allowing incest within his household, or worse, within his direct lineage, could ignite outrage. Miller understood the precarious balance he walked. If he pressed too hard, he risked being cast out of the camp entirely. But if he remained silent, he would allow the tragedy to continue unchecked, condemning future generations to the same fate. The following days only confirmed his fears. In conversations with the interpreter, he learned of children who had died young, their bodies weakened from birth. He heard rumors of daughters who never married outside the band, who bore children nonetheless. Each story pointed to the same unspoken truth, though never acknowledged outright. By the time the sun dipped behind the horizon on his 5th day in the camp, Miller knew that what he faced was not simply a medical puzzle, but a moral reckoning. The silence of the tribe was its shield, but for the children, silence had become a sentence. And in his chest, a question burned hotter with each passing hour. Would he have the courage to bring this hidden truth into the light? By the 6th day of his stay, Dr. Jonathan Miller sensed the invisible wall rising higher around him. At first, his presence had been tolerated, an outsider with medical knowledge, offering small remedies for common ailments. But as his questions sharpened and his observations grew more pointed, the air in the camp shifted. The glances he once received in quiet curiosity became guarded, even hostile. Conversations hushed as he approached, and children were pulled quickly into lodges whenever his figure appeared on the path. The chief, Wakantanka, still offered him formal respect, but the warmth of earlier days had cooled. Miller noticed that their meetings grew shorter, the chief's responses delivered through the interpreter in clipped, deliberate tones. One evening, when Miller pressed again for clarity about the children's fathers, the chief's voice rose, sharp and final. "This is not for outsiders." Though the interpreter hesitated, the meaning was unmistakable. Even the interpreter, once willing, now faltered in his role. A young man raised partly among whites, he had served as Miller's bridge to the community. But as the questions became heavier, he grew reluctant, sometimes refusing to translate at all. "You should not ask this," he muttered one night by the fire. "They do not forgive such questions. A man can lose his welcome, or more, when he speaks where silence is demanded." The obstacles extended beyond the tribe itself. Miller sent a message through a trader bound for St. Paul, hoping to alert the territorial authorities. Weeks later, the response returned, vague, dismissive, and wrapped in the careful language of bureaucracy. The government was wary of entangling itself in what it saw as tribal matters. Missionaries, too, offered little support. Though some whispered of their own suspicions, they feared alienating the very people they sought to convert. To confront the chief openly would risk losing all influence within the tribe. For Miller, the frustration was suffocating. He had evidence in plain sight: children born blind, mothers guarding secrets, families bound too tightly together. Yet without cooperation, his words would remain mere allegations. Worse, the resistance around him grew more tangible. A horse that had been tethered outside his tent one morning was found wandering miles away, its lead rope cut. A pouch of his medical instruments disappeared, only to be returned silently the next day. No words were spoken, but the message was clear: he was being watched, and his probing was unwelcome. Inside the camp, the tension deepened. On one occasion, Miller attempted to examine a young girl, perhaps 6 years old, whose cloudy eyes reflected the same condition as the others. Before he could even take her pulse, her mother pulled her away, shouting in Sioux words the interpreter refused to translate. The crowd that gathered outside the lodge that evening was thick with suspicion, their stares heavy and unyielding. By the fire that night, Miller wrote with trembling hands, "The truth lies within reach, yet every step toward it is met with resistance. The silence is not ignorance, it is protection. They guard this secret not out of shame alone, but out of fear of what exposure might bring." The obstacles seemed insurmountable. To the tribe, his questions threatened their cohesion, their authority, their very survival in a world already encroached upon by settlers and soldiers. To the outside world, it was easier to look away, to leave the Sioux to their own fate. Alone, with no allies willing to stand beside him, Dr. Miller felt the crushing weight of his isolation. Yet even in that isolation, he knew the silence could not last forever. Somewhere within this web of fear and secrecy, a voice would eventually break. And when it did, the truth would pour forth, no matter how fiercely others tried to contain it. The breakthrough came not in the chief's lodge, nor in the guarded words of mothers, but from the fringes of the camp. An older man named Maddow, no longer a warrior but once a scout for the band, sought out Dr. Miller late one evening. His gait was slow, his face creased with age and silence, but his eyes carried a weight that compelled Miller to listen. Seated by the fire, Maddow spoke in low tones to the interpreter, pausing often, as though deciding how much truth he could bear to release. What he revealed was not a full confession, but fragments, enough to deepen Miller's conviction. Years earlier, Maddow had witnessed the chief arrange marriages within the family. Daughters remained in the household, their children presented simply as gifts of the spirits, not requiring explanation. When other Sioux bands questioned, the chief dismissed the doubts, cloaking his choices in authority. Maddow admitted he had held his tongue for fear of banishment, but now, seeing the suffering of the children, his silence weighed heavier than loyalty. The next day, Miller pursued the trail further. He asked to see tribal records, rarely shared, but sometimes kept by missionaries who had visited years before. After much insistence, he managed to borrow a leather-bound ledger from a small chapel at a trading post. The entries listed baptisms and marriages recorded by traveling priests. There, amid fading ink, he noticed a pattern. The same surnames repeated, marriages between close kin, unions lacking outside witnesses. Names of fathers often went unrecorded, left blank, as though omission could conceal the truth. Medical evidence followed. Miller documented carefully the conditions of the children he examined. He noted deformities of the spine, weakened limbs, and above all, the blindness that recurred with relentless regularity. His sketches and descriptions filled pages, each one a silent testament to the consequences of secrecy. He knew that if ever these notes reached the hands of fellow physicians in the East, they would recognize the unmistakable signs of generations bred within too narrow a circle. Another testimony emerged unexpectedly from a missionary who had spent 2 winters among the Sioux. When Miller pressed him, the man hesitated, torn between duty to the tribe and loyalty to truth. At last, he admitted what he had seen. Young women bearing children whose fathers were never spoken of, infants hidden away from gatherings, and deaths of newborns that were explained as the will of God, but whispered of as something else. I was told not to ask, the missionary confessed, and I obeyed. Perhaps my obedience was cowardice. The weight of evidence now grew undeniable. Testimonies from Maddow, patterns in records, medical notes, whispered admissions, all pointed toward the same hidden reality. Yet even as the picture became clear, Miller understood the danger. To accuse directly would be to provoke outrage, perhaps violence. To remain silent would make him complicit in the continuation of the suffering he had witnessed. That evening, as the campfires burned low, Miller studied the faces of the children one last time. Their pale eyes reflected the flames, but not the world around them. He realized they were more than victims of circumstance. They were the living evidence of choices made in silence. And in their silence, Miller felt the echo of generations past, each one carrying forward the burden of secrecy until someone dared to speak. Now, he thought grimly, that burden rested on him. The breaking point arrived on a gray morning, when a heavy mist rolled across the Dakota plains and muffled the sounds of the camp. Dr. Jonathan Miller had risen early, restless from a night of uneasy sleep, and was preparing his notes when he was summoned abruptly to the chief's lodge. 2 men escorted him inside without words, their expressions carved in stone. The fire burned low, filling the lodge with a haze that stung Miller's eyes. Chief Wakantanka sat cross-legged, his features drawn with fatigue but hardened by resolve. Beside him were 2 of his daughters, each holding a small child in their arms. The children were pale-eyed, their tiny hands clutching instinctively at the air as though trying to grasp a world they could not see. The chief gestured sharply for the interpreter to begin. With a voice as steady as he could muster, the interpreter relayed the chief's words. "You see too much. You ask too many questions. You speak of things that outsiders do not understand." Miller steadied himself, knowing this might be his only chance. "I see children who suffer," he replied firmly. "This is not chance, nor illness. It is what happens when families do not open their circle. It is not only the will of nature, it is the cost of secrecy." The lodge fell into tense silence. The chief's gaze darkened, but before he could respond, one of the daughters spoke in a trembling voice. She clutched her child closer, her words rapid and low, but filled with anguish. The interpreter hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously between them, then finally translated. She says the fathers of these children are not strangers. They are her own blood." The words struck the lodge like thunder. The chief's shoulders stiffened, his daughter's eyes fixed on the ground, tears streaking their faces. For a moment, no one moved. Then the chief spoke again, his tone a mixture of defiance and sorrow. "We did what we must to keep the blood strong, to keep the family together. Outsiders would destroy us. Better to bind ourselves than to give our daughters away." Miller felt the weight of the revelation settle over him, heavier than he had imagined. The whispered suspicions, the vague testimonies, the evasive records, all now confirmed in a single, devastating admission. It was not rumor. It was truth. Generations of hidden unions, sanctioned by silence, had led to the children born without sight. The interpreter's hands shook as he relayed the final words of the chief's daughter. "She says she begged for another way. But there was no choice. Each time a child was born blind, she prayed the next would be spared. But the darkness only grew. The great revelation had arrived. not in the form of documents or second-hand accounts, but from the voices of those living within it. Their confession carried not only shame but also desperation, a plea for understanding in the face of unbearable consequences. Miller knew there was no returning from this moment. The truth had been spoken, and though the chief still clung to defiance, the silence that had shielded the family for decades was shattered. What remained was the raw, undeniable reality of generations bound by hidden incest, and the tragic legacy it had carved into the eyes of innocent children. The revelation, once spoken, could not be undone. Words spread through the camp with the speed of fire leaping across dry prairie grass. Whispers rose in lodges, faces turned away, and a heavy silence clamped down on every gathering. The authority of Chief Wakantanka, long unquestioned, began to fracture under the weight of truth. Among his people, judgment was complicated. Some stood by the chief, arguing that his decisions had preserved the band through years of hardship and isolation. They insisted that outsiders could not understand the crushing pressures of survival on the frontier, the dwindling food supplies, the fear of losing daughters to other bands or to settlers who offered only exploitation. To them, the chief's choices were tragic necessities. But others, particularly the younger men, could no longer bear the shame. They spoke openly, for the first time, of the children born blind, of the whispered unions no one dared name. Their words carried bitterness, not only toward the chief but toward the silence that had been forced upon the community. To them, the secrecy had not preserved the people, it had doomed them. Miller documented everything, knowing the outside world would demand proof. When he returned to the trading post, he presented his journal, sketches, and the testimonies he had gathered to missionaries and traders who had long suspected something hidden within the camp. Their reactions were a mix of shock and vindication. "We knew there was something amiss," one trader muttered, shaking his head, but never dared to say it aloud. Eventually, the matter reached the ears of territorial officials. Yet their judgment was not one of swift justice. To them, the Sioux were a people apart, governed by their own customs, beyond the full reach of American law. Missionaries urged intervention, but the government hesitated. "It is not our place to decide their marriages," one official wrote dismissively. The tragedy of the blind children was acknowledged, but responsibility was deflected back onto the tribe itself. Within the camp, however, consequences were immediate. The chief's authority weakened, his voice losing weight in councils. Some families quietly distanced themselves, leaving the band to join relatives in other Sioux groups. Mothers of blind children bore the brunt of whispered blame, even as their suffering was plain to see. The younger generation, restless and resentful, pressed for change, demanding that daughters be allowed to marry outside, that the circle of kinship be widened before more children were born into darkness. For Miller, the consequences were equally heavy. His presence was no longer welcome in the camp. Though no one threatened him outright, he felt the hostility sharpen each day, until finally the chief himself told him to leave. "You have seen what you came to see," the interpreter translated. "Now take your truth and go." Miller departed with mixed emotions, relief at escaping the tension, sorrow for the children left behind, and anger at the institutions unwilling to intervene. His testimony and records would circulate among missionaries and physicians, stirring debates in distant cities, but for the families within the Dakota Territory, little changed in the immediate years. The silence had been broken, but the consequences of generations of secrecy could not be undone overnight. The children remained, living symbols of a tragedy born of isolation and fear. And for those who had confessed, judgment came not from courts or governments, but from within their own hearts, where shame and sorrow settled more heavily than any punishment could. When Dr. Jonathan Miller left the Dakota Territory, the weight of what he had witnessed remained with him like an unshakable shadow. His journals traveled eastward, passed among missionaries, physicians, and government agents who debated the implications with clinical detachment. To them, the tragedy was a case study, an illustration of what happened when bloodlines turned inward. But to those who had lived it, the suffering was not an abstraction. It was their children, their sisters, their legacies scarred by silence. In the years that followed, change crept slowly through the community. Under pressure from younger voices within the band, marriages began to reach outward. Daughters were given to neighboring Sioux groups, some even to men who worked along the frontier. The circle of kinship widened, though not without resistance. For many elders, the shift felt like a betrayal of tradition. Yet the younger men and women insisted that it was the only way to break free from the curse of blindness that had haunted their lodges for too long. The children born without sight grew into adulthood with resilience that astonished even their caretakers. Some learned to weave, others to sing, their voices echoing across the plains during ceremonies. They found ways to live with dignity, even as their condition reminded the tribe daily of choices made in secrecy. Among them, a quiet strength emerged, a refusal to be defined entirely by tragedy. For every blind child, there was a mother who carried them on her back through bitter winters, a brother who guided them along the river, a sister who whispered the colors of the sunset they could not see. Their survival became its own form of testimony, proof that even in darkness, life could find meaning. Miller never forgot them. In lectures years later, he spoke not only of the medical evidence, but of the human cost, the silence of the mothers, the shame of the daughters, the pride of a chief who had chosen secrecy over honesty. He argued fiercely for the importance of outreach, education, and openness in frontier communities, warning that isolation was not merely a physical condition but a moral one. "It is not hunger or weather alone that destroys families," he wrote, "but the secrets they bind themselves to." In time, the tragedy of Chief Wakantanka's family became a quiet lesson passed through both Sioux and settler communities alike. Some framed it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrecy, others as evidence of the cost of cultural isolation. But beneath the interpretations lay a deeper truth, that human beings, when pressed by fear and pride, could wound their own future without ever intending to. By the late 1850s, new laws and missionary influence pushed for stricter oversight of marriages within Native communities, though these efforts were often less about compassion and more about control. Still, the memory of the blind children lingered, whispered in stories that circulated long after the tribe itself had moved on. For Miller, the lesson endured until his final days, that compassion must not stop at observation, and that truth, no matter how painful, was the only path to change. Standing once again on the Missouri River years later, he looked across the flowing water and thought of the children's pale eyes, unseeing yet filled with life. He realized then that history would not remember them as curiosities in a physician's notebook, but as a warning carried through generations, that silence breeds suffering, and only by speaking truth can future lives be spared.